So, today on the podcast, changes over at Disneyland. This past week I had some time to spend down at the Disneyland Resort and walk through both parks over a couple of days, largely to see what has changed and how construction projects are moving ahead. Though I'm pretty sure that the big push for some of these projects back in January and February was for Imagineering and construction teams to get those projects moving so they'd be difficult to cancel if new leadership, and back then in January and February, Bob Iger had not officially announced his successor, wanted to scale back at the parks and shift part of those capital expenditure funds earmarked for the general experiences division from parks and resorts over to something else in the experiences portfolio, such as, let's say, the cruise line. Most, but not all, of the announced parks projects were on their way in terms of construction before the new CEO was announced. And in ways, as the new CEO turned out to be Josh D'Amaro, a parks person himself, that rush to get ground cleared and steel to go vertical didn't really matter in terms of these particular issues. But getting those projects up and going did matter in terms of one unforeseen problem, namely the effects that the Iran conflict is now having on the U.S. economy, largely through fuel prices, and of course, fuel prices due to the shipping of products affect the price of many things beyond gas. Year-over-year inflation, according to the Consumer Price Index, is presently 3.8%. Some mainstream financial analysts are predicting inflation of around 4.2% or so in the months ahead. And beyond this, nearly every significant indicator places inflation at a higher level than the feds would like through the end of the year. And for us as park fans, here's the good news. By trying to get all of those projects going inside the park in terms of construction so they were difficult to cancel before management changed at Disney, those teams also, by sheer dumb luck, got those projects going before the economy started to move in problematic directions. A slump in the economy often means, at least over the past dozen years, that Disney cancels projects. And as evidence here, I offer you everything that was not built at Epcot after the pandemic. The Spaceship Earth redo, the Poppins attraction in the UK Pavilion, the multi-story festival center, and the Play Pavilion. Even if Disney can keep attendance at reasonable levels in the months ahead at its American parks, and in our last episode we talked about how the attendance figure was the easiest to manage, and by that I mean manipulate, good attendance at a park doesn't always mean a corresponding level of revenue and profit, because the hidden problems aren't in the overall attendance number, even though that's the marker most entertainment companies march out, but rather the problems are in other areas, such as food and beverage sales, merchandise sales, hotel occupancy, and so on. So even though, again, as we talked about last time, Disneyland will almost surely have good attendance numbers this summer, assuming there's some small promotions and discounts in the weeks ahead, this may not translate to the same level of revenue that the California resort has seen in recent years. That is, the same number of people in Disneyland this summer during an economically difficult time may not produce the same level of revenue because once there, those people in the parks are spending less. Disney World is a whole different set of issues, but the good news in all of that is this. Because the Disney teams tried to beat the CEO change with most new projects for the American parks, they also beat the unforeseen economic downturn that was also coming our way. And because of this, a lot of projects are now moving forward in the parks. So today, we're going to focus on the Disneyland Resort in California, as there are multiple unique projects being developed there, and by unique, I mean rides and attractions that aren't being developed anywhere else. Today we'll have 4 segments in this news update. One on Avengers campus, one on the yet-to-be-named Coco boat ride at DCA, one on Galaxy's Edge, and one about the Disneyland Forward project. We may not have a full conceptual idea of what is coming to the Toy Story parking lot as part of Disneyland Forward, and that's the large and mostly empty parking area that Disney owns by the convention center, an area that they've already earmarked as a place of guest expansion. But Disney has started to file some preliminary permits, suggesting that they may now be starting to focus in on this area. So if you're ready for all of this, let's get going. Here now is our construction update for Avengers Campus. In Avengers Campus, there's one big show building or show complex being built toward the back of the land, behind a tall construction fence. This building area will house both the Infinity Defense attraction and the Stark Flight Labs ride. The sides of the building are still open, but the roof is covered to the point that a work crew is regularly up there walking across it, developing various aspects of the structure, some of which is probably prep for an HVAC system. And one of the things that is now clear from looking at aerials is that this show building in terms of square footage is slightly larger than the show building for Radiator Springs Racers. But also it appears that the Infinity Defense building will use multiple levels, as we've talked about before, which will essentially expand the show areas inside the structure, whereas the show building for Radiator Springs doesn't do this. As we've talked about, this should be a substantial attraction. Around the perimeter right now of this show building complex are some cherry pickers and material lifts. These are being used both for structural work on the building and also to lay in electrical lines, with the pickers in particular appearing to be arranged to install electrical elements into the ceiling of the building. At the moment, the show building has a scrim around it. I know it's tempting to think that this is to hide what's going on inside, but nothing interesting is there yet and likely won't be there until the exterior walls are finished, which will probably happen later this year. Regardless, this scrim, which covers the whole structure, likely does a couple of practical things at this point. First, it is a visual marker, essentially an inexpensive fall prevention barrier to remind workers exactly where the edge is on this open structure. And more importantly, especially in spring and late fall, that scrim is a type of wind prevention. Orange County, California is windy, with some very high gusts coming through the area typically in the spring, that is, right now. Gusts can reach 40 miles an hour in the spring. Occasionally, the winds in the fall clock in higher than that, with the summer months usually being fairly tame. So the scrim is likely there to protect equipment such as newly installed electrical lines inside from being disturbed by weather. The show building is moving along very quickly, especially for a construction project in a Disney park. And as I walked around the area this past weekend, I was struck with how carefully sightlines are being managed for this project. From Cars Land, which is the themed area right next door, this new structure is reasonably screened off with a combination of existing rockwork, decorative walls, and trees. Even from the very end of Luigi's Casa de la Tires, that is the Rollicking Roadsters ride, which is at the very far back edge of Cars Land, feet from Avengers Campus, you can only see just the partial top story of the now under construction show building, which is mostly hidden behind a decorative wall at the back of the Luigi ride. And I think that this is fabulous, to create enclosed visual pockets inside of the park, But where was this same design imperative back when Tower of Terror was being redesigned as Mission Breakout, with its exterior decorated with exposed pipes, antennas, cables, and other retro-futuristic golden doodads, until it looked something like a Tower of Terror version of Tamatoa, that giant coconut crab from Moana. You remember the crab who intentionally sounded a lot like a 1980s version of David Bowie, even if Tamatoa's shell looked a lot more like a David Bowie costume from the 1970s glam rock years. But regardless, construction is moving forward on Stark Labs and Infinity Defense, along with finishing the floors and the roof, as it appears that's where construction is right now. The next steps are likely stairs, more electrical work, plumbing, elevator shafts, and HVAC, then finishing the structural envelope with exterior walls. That is, even though the shape of the finished building is now outlined from construction, we are still many months before we get to the process of installing the ride inside that structure. No doubt the ride elements, including stages, vehicles, props, etc., are being built elsewhere right now, but in terms of a realistic timeline, at Disneyland, both with Rise of the Resistance and more recently Runaway Railway, it took about a year and a half after the show building was complete to install the ride and show elements before the attraction opened. And beyond this, for that multi-story structure that Rise now inhabits, it took about a year and a half to create that show building by itself, from foundation to the finished structure. So adapting that timeline to this project here, we are probably looking at late 2026 to finish the building shell, and then mid-2028 for the ride to open, and that is if the ride is a mix of physical stages and screens. If it's mostly a screen-based ride, construction might move a little faster, because aside from the ride system, there's far less to install. But if someone were to force me right now to pick a date for the opening, I'd put my money on spring or summer 2028, though, as I've mentioned before, I wouldn't be surprised if Stark Flight Lab, which is a far less complicated project, opens earlier. I do see a situation where Disney wants to lure local guests into the park to see Flight Lab, and then ask those same guests back 6 or 8 months later to experience Infinity Defense, just as they did with Smuggler's Run opening months before Rise of the Resistance. The big drawback here, though, is that Flight Lab, at least from the artwork, appears to be an incredibly low-throughput ride, meaning that if Disney mounts an advertising campaign just around Flight Lab, there's going to be a number of guests on a typical day who cannot experience it. But in terms of Infinity Defense, I am guessing that Disney very much wants to open this before the 2028 Olympics. These start on July 14th, 2028, and back in 1984, the last time the Summer Olympics were in Los Angeles, Disneyland was surprisingly empty. Many people figured that traffic would be unbearable and that crowds would overwhelm not just Disneyland, but all of the local theme parks, and they simply stayed home. Back in 1984, a Disney spokesperson said, "If attendance continues like this, it will be the worst summer we've ever had," and then admitted that there were no lines at most Disneyland attractions. I remember that summer, and the park was indeed empty during the Olympics. So to be clear about this prediction, I doubt that Disneyland wants the expanded Avengers campus area open by summer 2028 to increase park capacity or even to bring in out-of-town guests. Rather, I do think that Disney wants the Avengers campus expansion area open because the eyes of the world will be focused on Southern California. No doubt there will be news and travel log stories about Southern California attractions, which are then broadcast around the globe. And these video peeks at the park will be valuable to the company to show the world that DCA has some new attractions not available at any other Disney park. And after the Olympics, Disneyland should see a subsequent bump in attendance from public relations activities and video segments that are broadcast during the time of the Olympics, even if the larger visitation wave happens in the year following the games. If I had to take a guess, that would be the target, to have this particular project done by summer 2028, maybe a little earlier, so that national and international news outlets can show the world the unique offerings that are only available here at the Disneyland Resort. Moving now to the back of DCA, to Pixar Pier, early land prep and area demo continues for the Coco boat ride. Though the area now is mostly just graded dirt, eventually there will be another show building developed here that should be visually screened off fairly well from areas inside the park, except for gaps and various fences and gates, and of course, views from elevated attractions like the Incredicoaster or the Pixar Pal-Around Ferris wheel. It's almost impossible to see the work or even the tall excavator from inside the park, but you can see this clearly from outside the park and also from the upper floors of the Pixar Place Hotel. To be specific, the work area for the Coco ride is mostly behind the far end of the Incredicoaster and Boardwalk Pizza. Already, Disney has removed trees and some low structures and has put up a green construction fence around the area. The show building, based on the land prep, will likely be a long, narrow structure running parallel to Disneyland Drive. Almost surely, in this ride, you'll take a boat down one side of the building, then make a turn and come up the other. That is assuming that this is a straightforward water flow-based system like Pirates or Small World, and not something with mechanical turns or lifts. And from what we've seen so far, it suggests a traditional boat ride. More Disney boat rides use an overall left-handed turn course than a right-handed turn course, so that's what I've been picturing anyways. And the one piece of interior art that we have for this ride, arranged inside the Land of the Dead, features Miguel and Hector from the movie Coco on a slightly raised public stage, with Hector singing and Miguel playing his guitar. And that is almost the exact same finale scene as in Grand Fiesta Tour in the Mexico Pavilion at Epcot, only on that raised outdoor public stage are the three caballeros, not Miguel and Hector. The narrative movement of Grand Fiesta Tour is that guests, that is you and me, seated on boats are working their way to a public concert. And I gotta say, from the one piece of art for the Coco ride, that sort of makes it look like this is also the narrative movement for this new ride. Specifically, that guests are slowly working their way through the Land of the Dead to that outdoor public stage for a concert as well. And one more thing here. If you look at that one piece of concept art for the interior of the Coco ride, above that public stage are some LED fireworks arranged into the ceiling, which is exactly what's above the stage at the end of Grand Fiesta Tour as well. If the Coco ride is loosely modeled off the track course footprint for Grand Fiesta Tour, then later, if Epcot wanted to swap out its Three Caballeros theme for Coco, they would mostly just need to make a second set of animatronics and other stage and prop elements. But again, in that, I'm just spitballing speculation out there. But I know a number of Disney park managers who would much rather have characters from a recent 2017 film in the parks as opposed to characters who are mostly but not entirely tied to a 1944 film that was made and released during World War II. But to get back to the construction site in California, it appears, again based on land prep, that the show building will go very close to the sidewalk, maybe 15 or 20 feet from pedestrians outside of DCA, probably with some new fencing, trees, and a narrow service road between the building and the public sections of the street. It also looks like, based on what is being cleared there now, that some backstage areas behind the coaster, such as a maintenance building and some storage buildings, aren't going to be demoed. At least they're outside of the space that's currently being prepped. So this makes the space even tighter. I don't think there's any outdoor space in Pixar Pier for the queue for this ride, so one of my questions now is, where does the queue go? Is it integrated into the show building, which makes the potential space for the ride even smaller? Or is there also an outdoor queue area that is not yet being prepped, as an outdoor queue area could be prepped much later in the construction process? At the moment, there's a single excavator there along with a couple of storage containers. All of that situated inside the long, green fenced-off construction area. What's probably happening now is work toward underground infrastructure with electrical, water, and sewer, and there's some fencing and other elements that still need to be demoed. Also, and here I'm guessing, there's likely an ordinance that requires emergency vehicles to have reasonable access to DCA. So while ground prep continues, there will likely need to be an access road maintained in this section of the park, and that road will probably be moved more than once until a new permanent perimeter access road can be put in place. But now that the attraction area is reasonably well defined by land prep, I don't think we're getting large stage areas in this attraction. I think we're going to get some shallow stage areas that are all very close to the boat flume. Again, like in Frozen Ever After, or perhaps more to the point again, like Grand Fiesta Tour. Still, this should be a very nice C or D ticket addition to the park. There's still a little over an acre of usable space in this area, even if Disney doesn't demo those back-of-the-house buildings, maybe 1.2 acres. But in that area there needs to be the show building, likely that access perimeter road, a physical buffer space between the building and the sidewalk. As parade floats are still stored back here, there likely needs to be some way for those parade floats to access the park, and unless something else is cleared or demoed, there needs to be space inside the show building for that queue. So I think we're looking at a show building for the ride that is roughly around 40 or maybe 45,000 square feet. In comparison, the show building for Pirates at Disneyland is well over twice as large. Even Runaway Railway is about double the size, but for Railway that also includes a fairly extensive indoor queue. So when Disney compares the Coco boat ride that's being built here to the already existing Pirates ride at Disneyland, which they've already done in certain comparisons, they probably mean that the level of detail, not so much the ride length, will be comparable between those two rides. Overall, the size of the show building, if this plays out as we're talking about, would be similar to the overall space for the Frozen show building at Epcot, which is still a pretty good-sized dark ride. Again, the work on this ride is about 1 year behind Infinity Defense. It's also going to be a smaller ride. But in terms of just construction, if I had to give this a guess, I would say we're looking at late 2028 or early 2029 for an opening, but in terms of making a PR effect, I gotta say, opening this particular ride on Dias de los Muertos, that's the Day of the Dead, November 1st, 2028, as the Land of the Dead is central to the movie, has gotta look pretty enticing in terms of a marketing plan for this attraction. But now let's leave DCA and head over to Disneyland for updates to the West Coast version of Galaxy's Edge. Let's start in an unusual place, with the nighttime projection show in Galaxy's Edge. And at the end of the segment here, we'll finish with the nighttime projection show as well. In California at night, Disney hosts a projection show typically twice a night called Shadows of Memory, in which images accompanied by narration and music are projected onto the spires, right behind the Millennium Falcon. The show is mostly a highlights reel of the Skywalker saga, with a strong emphasis on the prequel and original trilogies, basically the story of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. The show has been in Disneyland's version of Galaxy's Edge for a little over a year now, and I always thought that Disney focusing this show almost entirely on the two trilogies that it didn't make, that is, the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, suggested that Disney was starting to understand the problem with Galaxy's Edge. The central elements that, over time, many fans have connected with were focused on Luke, Han, and Darth, not so much the characters that came after them. To be fair, there's a brief nod in the projection show to the Disney-produced sequel trilogy, the one with Rey, Poe, and Finn, maybe a minute at the end of the projection show in which the narrator says that the Force was passed on to others after Luke. And to be fair, at the time that this projection show premiered, that is last year, the timeline in Galaxy's Edge was set between the second and third films in the sequel trilogy. That is, supposedly, all of those people on Batuu, including us visitors, wouldn't know the end to the sequel trilogy. But all of that aside, the emphasis of this projection show was on the lives of Darth Vader and Luke. And if you've never seen it, it's a nice switch up from the familiar fireworks. A few guests bring their lightsabers and light them up high at the end of the show. But this projection show, a year old now, predicted larger and more recent changes to Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland. And for clarity here, these elements are only being engaged in California, at least for now. Each of the 6 American Disney parks has its own budget, and Disneyland tends to use some of that money for smaller changes to freshen up existing areas, to bring in Southern California repeat visitors, which are its primary audience. These changes include seasonal tags to World of Color, a lot more live entertainment, a wider list of seasonal holidays extensively celebrated, such as Day of the Dead and Lunar New Year, and seasonal overlays for multiple rides. Whereas managers at the Florida resort know that small changes to their parks really aren't going to bring in any more people on planes for a trip to Florida. But one of the smaller changes, or really a set of smaller changes, was recently taken up at Galaxy's Edge in California. Specifically, part of Galaxy's Edge was rethemed to the original trilogy, that is, the trilogy with Luke, Leia, Han, and Vader. To start with, when guests enter Galaxy's Edge now, they hear the iconic Star Wars music by John Williams. On a gut level, this makes the experience feel more like something centered in the Star Wars films. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. But inside of this musical presentation, Disney is also signaling a change in terms of how this land now relates to guests. And let me set this up a bit. Back in 1955, when Disneyland was being constructed, based on how money was spent, there were essentially 2 competing ideas for how guests would probably engage a theme park once it was built. Based on what Walt approved financially for the park, Walt seemed to believe that guests would want to come to a highly detailed park so they could participate in small ways in the stories and role-playing that went on there, such as with the daily shootouts in Frontierland. C.V. Wood, who was the park's first president, again based on how he wanted to spend money, believed that guests wouldn't necessarily want to be co-participants in the stories that were being told in the park. They would simply want to watch those stories and shows like one big audience moving from land to land. Or to put it simply, Walt thought guests in some way would want to contribute to the stories in the park by finding a role for themselves there, and C.V. Wood thought guests would essentially want to be an audience who didn't participate in the stories, but simply watched them as though they were live stage shows. And let me put this clearly, both of these were well thought out and compelling theories about how Disneyland would work after it opened, and both of these theories pretty much define the two poles around which theme park theories have functioned for the last, say, 70 years. Now, fast forward from the time of Walt and C.V. Wood by about 60 years to the 20-teens. When Imagineers designed Galaxy's Edge, they initially relied on the theory that Walt ascribed to, that guests in Galaxy's Edge would want to participate in the storytelling by wearing robes, holding lightsabers, going on missions, and so on. To solidify this Galaxy's Edge in terms of its sound design for the area was arranged as though guests were in the actual world represented in the movie. And if you're in the world of a Star Wars movie, that is, if you're actually a resident or a visitor to a place like Batuu, then you don't hear the John Williams soundtrack as you go about your daily life. You hear the rumble of starfighters, the chatter of droids, and so on. And in the original version of Galaxy's Edge, that's exactly what you heard. The revised Galaxy's Edge, that is the one that recently opened, takes C.V. Wood's theory for park experience and arranges the land a little more around visitors being an audience. Now when you walk into the land, you hear the John Williams soundtrack. So this music is letting us know that we are more part of the movie audience visiting the world of the film and less in the role of a co-participant in the actual activities of Batuu. So that is the first experiential change that guests noticed as they enter this area. And once guests are inside Galaxy's Edge, it now has two distinct themed areas. The Resistance Forest, that is, the forest around Rise of the Resistance, is still set to the sequel trilogy, with Rey, Finn, Kylo, and so on. And there's a practical consideration here. To re-theme this area to the original trilogy would mean to redo what is the most expensive attraction Disney has ever created, so that probably isn't happening anytime soon. But the upper area, the Black Spire Outpost, the Millennium Falcon Courtyard, the walkways around Oga's, and so on, are now visually themed to the original trilogy. Some of the props and banners have changed to better align this area with the Galactic Empire and the Civil War period, as opposed to the First Order that used to be there. With this, some characters in the land have changed as well. Most notably, Kylo Ren is entirely gone. For Disney Visa holders, you can find him in the afternoons for about 4 hours a day, taking photos with people over in the Tomorrowland launch bay, and the line there is really short, which probably tells you how this villain's popularity has fallen off a good deal after his last film, which was 7 years ago. Over in the Black Spire area of Galaxy's Edge, however, replacing him is essentially his grandfather, Darth Vader. And though Vader's last significant and extended film appearance was over 40 years ago, his popularity in Galaxy's Edge is doing just fine. And it's not just Darth. Other original characters are now in the Black Spire area, as Luke has on his black robe and that one black glove This means this section of Galaxy's Edge is set around the time of Return of the Jedi. Luke is joined by actors playing Leia and Han. The overall time shift, in theory, works fairly well, I think. The masked characters, such as Darth, really fill the emotional plane of a Star Wars-themed area. I feel the same about Mando and Grogu, both of whom are here as well. But the face characters, such as Luke, Leia, and Han, are, in my opinion, somewhat of a problem in their current presentation. That is, they really don't look much like their screen counterparts, not only in terms of facial likeness, but in some cases the costuming is off, as are the voices and gestures. And honestly, my expectations here were a little bit higher, largely because when Galaxy's Edge first opened in California, the initial actress who played Rey was a nearly perfect match to the screen character, not only in terms of facial and body likeness, but also in terms of costuming, voice, and gestures. And that type of in-park cohesion was fabulous. But because there's a significant difference in terms of the appearance of Luke, Leia, and Han in Galaxy's Edge, including some costume elements, it immediately took me out of the continuous dream of walking through a Star Wars movie area and put me more in the mindset of something like Comic-Con. Beyond the visuals, and maybe some of that simply couldn't be helped, their voices didn't sound like the characters either. Some impressionists and voice actors make a living by pitching their tone and vocal presentation so that it is nearly identical to that of a famous actor. So maybe it might have been difficult to find really strong lookalikes. But I sort of suspect it might have been easier to find actors who sort of looked like the screen character, but could imitate the vocal presentation of that character spot on. And sharp voice work would have done a lot to more fully bring me into this experience. Beyond this, at least for Han, I identify this particular character with a set of identifiable movements, a swagger while walking, the crooked partial smile, the practice shrug, his hands on hips stance, the knowing and irritated glances, thumbs tucked into the top of his oversized belt, and so on, but this wasn't there as well. So ultimately, neither the voice nor the visual presentation of the face characters pulled me into the space of an experience deeply inspired by the film. Or to put it simply, the lack of a strong likeness on multiple levels reminded me that this was, in fact, not the movie, which allowed a little of the Star Wars dreaminess to crumble away. But around me, admittedly, other guests seemed to be more easily pushing aside any visual or voice differences to engage the actors as though they were the characters from the film. And this brings me to my next point. The revamped Galaxy's Edge has an odd push and pull mix of experiences. On the one hand, as guests enter the area, they hear the John Williams movie score. That is, it reminds us that we're a film audience. But once guests are in the Black Spire area, the opposite is true. The conversations and interactions with walk-around characters suggest that we guests are supposed to participate, pretending the people we're talking to are Luke and Hans and so on. And so it's a really odd mix of Walt and C.V. Wood's different understanding of how a theme park might work, in which there's no unifying theory to align the experience guests are supposed to have in Galaxy's Edge. So despite the inconsistencies in terms of the overall timeline, or the way guests are supposed to relate to the land once they are here, I will say that the revised version of Galaxy's Edge, despite its underlying and rather noticeable contradictions, actually works better than the original version. But for me, most of this is not because there's a better underlying framework that holds the experience together. Part of it has to do with the land, at least the upper part of it is now focused on a more popular trilogy. But beyond this, it's rather really simple. It works better now, despite the underlying issues, because Disney is spending more money to make Galaxy's Edge in California into a high-touch experience with a lot of one-on-one character interactions with guests. So overall, the land does work better, even if there's some unusual disunity between the two timelines now in Galaxy's Edge, and also a lack of verisimilitude of the actors playing the original trilogy characters, and also no consistent way that guests are supposed to imagine their roles in this area once they arrive in Galaxy's Edge. And before I push on to our last topic today, I should add that the projection show, the one I talked about at the start of this section, as of last week now has a new 3-minute segment at the end focused on Grogu, in which he visually recalls key moments from his life, both from the series and I'm pretty sure from the about-to-be-released film. But as I write this on Thursday, May 21st, that film is not quite out yet. But this too seems a positive development because of all the Star Wars films and series produced in the last, let's say, 10 years. The Mandalorian, at least for me, has the strongest continuation of the emotional elements central to the original trilogy. And I'm pretty sure there's at least some other people who felt that connection as well. And again, I haven't seen the new Mando movie yet, but as we talked about months ago here on the podcast, word on the street is that reviews are probably going to be pretty mixed, and that the film will likely feel more like an expanded set of TV episodes than a unified movie arranged around a single and significant plot. But beyond some of that intellectual scruffiness of the revised Galaxy's Edge, in terms of what is the role of guest and how do the two time frames relate to each other since they're only a few feet away, the revamped Galaxy's Edge, again with more walk-around characters, to me feels like a better overall experience than the version that was there earlier this year. Last up in our walk-around today is the Toy Story parking lot. This is the large plot of land, essentially just a parking lot that is just over 50 acres and owned by Disney, located by the Anaheim Convention Center, which is earmarked for the Disneyland Forward expansion plan. Initially, Disney showed artwork a few years ago that suggested that this land might be turned into something like a West Coast version of Disney Springs. But then after the Disneyland Forward proposal was passed, Disney had the ability to build essentially whatever they want there, including possibly a third theme park, which has led to speculation that this is what would show up there. And now comes the mystery. About 2 weeks ago, Disney filed 2 minor permits for the Toy Story lot. The details as filed are listed as confidential. Most Disneyland permits don't have this confidential designation, and I mostly see this marking on permits that are likely related to the Disneyland Forward expansion areas. But following these permits, the Orange County Register ran a story suggesting that these permits were in fact for what was expected to be a Disney Springs-like center near the Anaheim Convention Center. One with shops, restaurants, entertainment areas, and hotels, possibly also one ride. And following this, I saw a slew of online articles on various Disney sites, pointing to that Orange County article to explain that this was now what Disney was in fact planning to build on this land. So I went through both permits, the parts you can see anyway, and I can't find anything there to suggest that the plan is definitely for a Disney Springs-like development there. I do agree that this is the most likely development for this land, as it would be rather unwieldy to build a third park this far from Disneyland, even with something like a people mover or skyliner connecting the two areas, because strip malls and various businesses are between these two sections of Anaheim. I see this area working better as something like a West Coast version of Disney Springs. But to be specific, I don't see anything in these permits, and again, a lot of this is listed as confidential, that would now pin Disney down definitely to a shopping, entertainment, and hotel development. But the good news is this. There are 2 permits for the Toy Story lot, which were filed near the start of May, which suggests that Disney is likely actively exploring what they would like to build there. First, the east side parking garage needs to go in to provide parking for that side of the resort, but after that, Disney could be in the position to start developing a fairly large project on the 50-plus acres they own by the convention center. But to figure out what's actually going to go there, and I'm not sure Disney actually knows yet, we're probably going to have to wait for a few more years. I'll be back next week with a new episode. This week we covered the California resort with most everything that's going on there, so at least right now the plan is to cover, or at least start to cover, the East Coast next week. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this podcast on Apple or Spotify or one of the many other public feeds, we would love to have you join us as a subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Apple and Spotify and the other outlets, you will find 100 episodes. But over on Bandcamp, you'll find over 400, including many albums that collect up our longer series into multi-hour narrative presentations. The best reason, however, to become a monthly subscriber is to support the work we do here. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so Bandcamp supporters are the people who keep this whole enterprise going, including the weekly podcast that keeps you either up to date with detailed stories related to the current Disney company or in-depth explorations on the history of the studio and the parks. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.